Hi, my name is Skip Stewart. I'm the Vice President and Chief Improvement Officer for Baptist Memorial Healthcare. Today we're going to cover a subject and a word that gets used often, but I'm not so sure that we always understand that word, and that word is the word culture. We're going to hear from an individual that actually coined the word organizational culture, and a father-son combination that has over 100 years of studying, thinking, and writing about this subject. In these videos, we're going to be looking at the structure of culture, the practice of culture, and then ultimately the dynamics of culture change. So let's learn together.
So, Skip, it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you folks about this. And so I want us to give a little bit of context on this picture. So this picture is what we describe as the lily pond model for how to think about the structure of culture. So there's a lot there. We will get through all of it, but I want to give a little bit of context. And that is that culture is so amorphous that going back to the early days of social anthropology, people have tried to come up with metaphors to describe what culture is. It's everywhere. It eats strategy for breakfast, and yet we have trouble describing what it is because it's so pervasive and powerful in our lives. It's one of those things where we've sort of joked that we really need, like Eskimos have words for snow, we really need that many words for culture. So a lot of what we're going to try to do in these conversations is provide a vocabulary so that we're not talking about one thing called culture, we're talking about a number of dimensions of culture. And so just one other thing on the metaphors is that there was I suppose there still is a predominant metaphor that people like to describe culture as an iceberg. And the idea of the iceberg that at one level is sort of a compelling representation for culture is that most of it is hidden underwater. And so the simple idea that you think you see an iceberg, but what you're seeing is only the 5 or 10% of it that's exposed, and the rest of it, the mass of that culture, is actually hidden underwater. That's true. That's compelling. That makes sense, and that's a good image to have. However, there's a couple problems with it. One is that culture is not frozen. So ice as a natural element representing culture is probably the wrong natural element. We would argue that water and air might be better than ice. And we'll get to that. I think the other thing is that the reason ice is an issue is that it's not hard, and it's dynamic. It's continually moving and evolving. And I suppose you could argue that icebergs continually move and evolve, but we just sort of felt like it was, as a metaphor, it's too monolithic. We need something that helps us describe all the different dimensions, or as many as we can comfortably grok in as we try to break this thing down. And so that's where we arrived, or Ed arrived probably 10, 15 years ago at the lily pond of at least breaking down the culture that we see, which we describe as artifacts, the culture that we hear, people representing that culture will say things about their culture, and those generally we would refer to as espoused values. And then what's underneath the surface of our lily pond is, in some respects can be thought of as the history of the company. Or is the complexity of the socio-technical system that we as outsiders would have to really, really study deeply using the term ethnography. You'd have to study at a very deep level. But for people practicing the culture, represents the full complexity of that socio-technical system. So that's how we got to the lily pond. And if you want to go sort of talk through now what it means and how we can think about it as this dynamic and generative metaphor that helps us remember the vocabulary, but also kind of really gives us a sense of how dynamic culture is.
Great. That's a good lead into my explaining why I find this as a useful metaphor. And it starts with the idea of how do organizations become organizations in the first place, because culture is, after all, a property of an organization. So the organization as a model, it goes way back to our thinking of organizations as machines. And my mentor, the professor at MIT who hired me, was a leadership theorist who said that, these machine models of organizations are wrong. Organizations are living systems. They are batches of people working together to create something. So I found this lily pond a much more friendly metaphor, because it reminded me that this farmer could be an innovative executive who's got a new product, white lilies in a lily pond that happened to have been discovered to produce some very important chemicals that are very useful in some of the services that hospitals or the healthcare system needs. So he is an entrepreneur, or she is an entrepreneuress, builds an organization, and you can think of that organization as the seeds are the engineers and his innovative people that he or she hires to create the organization. And those seeds have to grow over time in a lily pond. And so you can think of the pond and the water in it as kind of the capital investments and all the buildings and all the material that requires hiring people who can do the production part. And then he has a human resource system that makes sure that these engineers and the builders and the marketers of the white blossoms are all in good coordination with each other. So each part of the lily pond is, in a sense, a piece of that human organization that is technically based on the product and service that the organization produces, but it's produced by people working together under this farmer's leadership. Now, they go ahead and build their pond and produce a bunch of white lilies, and it's a roaring success. They prove to be successful. The organization grows. And now what used to be just the farmer's idea of a product or a service and has become a successful organization, the employees now say, hey, we know what we're doing. We've got a successful product here. Our boss is a genius. He has created a successful organization. And so what we do now, the kinds of seeds we buy, the kinds of engineers we hire, the way we organize ourselves, all of that now is the way to do things. And that way to do things, our belief in our norms, ourselves, that we know how to do this, that mix of norms and ideas and behaviors the daily behavior, the way we do things around here to produce these white blossoms is our culture. And they no longer realize that they've built that together through their success, and that is very stable until, guess what? Somebody discovers that the white blossoms also have a carcinogen in them. And it has to do somehow with the color. And what we really need now in the market is we've got to get these white blossoms off the market, because now we need green ones and blue ones. And so what to do? The organization now has a major dilemma. The product that made them successful has a glitch in it. They have to do something different. And of course, there will be a few simplistic-minded people will say, well, wait a minute, why don't we just paint the blossoms green and blue and sell them that way anyway? No, because it might be illegal, it might be immoral, even though these carcinogens might be very mild, it's not the right thing to do. We really have to figure out how to produce green ones and blue ones. And how are we going to do that? We're going to examine all of our behavior in the entire socio-technical system. We might have to ask our engineers to learn how to make blue and green blossoms. Some of them will say, sure, boss. Others will say, that's not me, and we're going to leave. We might have a major problem with some of our best technical talent refusing to do the new product or actually leaving. We might have to hire some new people. The marketing folks might have to totally redesign the way in which they highlighted whiteness as being the key to their product and service, and say we now really have to figure out how to market blue and green because that's what the market wants. And then the human resource system says, but wait a minute, we can keep all these engineers, we'll just give them better perks. We'll make sure that we don't lose these good people. And that will work maybe for a month or two, because some of those engineers will like the new perks, but they might not be competent to produce the new product. So then they bring in a culture analyst facilitator who will remind them, no, folks, culture involves the behavior of all of you, including the CEO, who's got to stop saying to the market that this pond uses only the finest fertilizers, because that might not cure the problem of what's wrong with the white blossoms. So as they try to deal with the new market and the required changes, what we will discover is that all the levels of the organization might have to become involved at the behavioral level. No one group will probably have all the solutions. They have to recognize themselves structurally as a socio-technical system that now has a culture which needs to be evolved into enabling them to produce something new and different. That will require some culture change. The whole culture won't have to be dropped, but some elements will have to be evolved. And I find this pond metaphor useful for thinking about that. So, Peter, any further comments?
No, there was one sort of elaboration that I thought might be useful too, is to think about, because we experience this a lot in organizations that we talk about headwinds and tailwinds. One of the headwinds in this case of switching to green and blue lilies, may well be that some of those original engineers don't even believe that there's a carcinogen in the white lilies. We get very, very fundamental resistance to changes like that because they have so much invested in the product that they engineered that even if there's a huge red flag or huge, barrier to progress with that product, you get a lot of resistance to the point of not even believing that a change needs to be made. It's all about how do these things line up, right? Does what the market is saying line up to what the product engineering and production people believe? And is that also somehow accurately represented in what the company is saying about itself? Because if those things are out of alignment, A, the market always figures it out, and B, you end up getting factions and subgroups and subcultures within the organization that can be very destabilizing.
And companies can go under if they can't make these adjustments.
Yeah, just quickly on that, I have a quick story that's a local story, which is that the Facebook campus is about 5 miles away from where I live, and there's a big sign out front that on one side of the Facebook sign is the thumbs up image, and the other side is an old Sun Microsystems logo, because the company Sun Microsystems, which was acquired by Oracle in 2010, was occupied that campus. And Facebook, quite intentionally, and this is the sign is an artifact, and leaving the Sun Microsystems facing the employees was an espoused value. And the espoused value was, we're not going to be like Sun Microsystems, which got acquired by a bigger company. We're Facebook, we're not going to be like Sun. So they were expressing that espoused value back to their employees, who would see the Sun logo as they left the building, whereas customers would see the Facebook sign or the thumbs up artifact as they entered the building. Now, flash forward to now, that is now called Meta, right? That's now a Meta logo. It's not the Facebook logo anymore. And they're trying to sort of change their image. They're trying to change their company. And these artifacts are very visible, but you always have to be sort of trying to sort out, okay, what are they saying underneath? Well, the Meta sign still has the Sun Microsystems logo on the back. And then you have to ask yourself, and does Meta stand for some of the other things that Facebook became famous for? For instance, move fast and break things was a mantra. It was a value that their engineering teams generally held. Well, was that value, is that value part of what got them into, arguably some controversy with the market around, disinformation and things like that? They were so focused on growth, move fast and break things. So they're trying to evolve their company with this sort of reinstantiation of calling themselves Meta and being focused on a longer term goal around the metaverse. But are they still moving fast and breaking things? Is that an underlying value that even if they realign their behavior around Meta and the metaverse, they still have values that are very sticky that they hold on to because it's what made them successful in the first place?
Let me pick up on that and say we've now given you a couple of examples, but there's still a need to have a formal definition. And thinking now about the examples that we've been talking about, the best way to think about a formal definition is that the culture is everything that is the accumulated shared learning of that group In the case of the lily pond, as it solved initially its problems of surviving in a world that wanted the medicines of the white lilies. So they adapted and internally integrated to do that, and it worked well enough to be considered valid. And therefore, one way of testing is it culture is what we teach to the new members of the organization as the way to perceive, think, and feel. So the new people, the new kids on the block learn how to behave. They learn how to be properly respectful of the boss. They learn which engineers are the key technologists and they better be nice to them. All this social learning is as much part of the culture as the actual technology. And this accumulated learning then becomes gradually, as the organization continues to succeed, actually a system of beliefs and values and norms. And now the key thing that happens is people live it and behave it, and it drops out of awareness. They don't realize anymore that this is not the only way to be in the world, that this is our company's way of being in the world. This is our company's behavior and the way we feel about things. And this is what we teach to the newcomers. So the formal definition kind of tries to capture the dynamic story of how it got to be this way. And so maybe the most important point about culture is that it's a learned phenomenon. It's not something that's handed to you. A company evolves its culture through its own learning processes. So maybe, Skip, that's enough said for this particular way of looking at structure.
Yeah. I want to add one thought, and that is that the idea of external adaptation, in other words, markets change, competitors change, and generally in the 21st century, the rate of change is increasing. So the challenge of external integration is always going to be there, or external adaptation. And our term internal integration can really be thought of as sort of a proxy for resiliency. How resilient are we as an organization, or how agile are we as an organization at dealing with that challenge of external adaptation? So do we have systems that allow us to innovate quickly? Do we believe in design thinking, or do we have processes for sort of rapid innovation? So it's the ability to adapt to external challenge, but it's also a sense of internal resiliency is that combination that successful companies have.
Well, guys, this has been great. This is the first of 3 videos. We talked about the structure of culture, and in this cognitive flow, we'll next talk about the practice of culture. So until then, thank you for everyone. Hopefully this was helpful, and we'll have more to come in the near future.